I guess I should probably get started. I always have that kind of slight punctuality anxiety about starting exactly on the time I'm supposed to start. Hello, thank you all for choosing to be here. My name's Hugh Dellar. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer and coursebook writer. I'm based in North London, so it's a kind of easy hop for me down to Brighton. And what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the way we think about competence and what we do in our teaching to improve student competence. And we're going to begin with a strange kind of a metaphorical parallel, if you like, which is basketball. I almost went out this morning and bought a basketball as a little kind of prop to stop me feeling nervous before the talk. And then I realised it probably wouldn't bounce on carpet and I'd be sat here with a basketball that wasn't bouncing. So I've spared myself that humiliation. Don't know how many of you watch basketball, but in basketball you have this moment called a free throw. And a free throw is not only horrific to pronounce because of the th and the th, but it's a kind of unopposed attempt to try to score a point by shooting from behind the free throw line, which is at the edge of this restricted area. It's a bit like a penalty in football. It's usually awarded after a foul, and a successful throw into the hoop is worth 1 point. And it's taken from a very specific point, which is 15 feet away from the basket. And when you look at sort of high-level basketball like the NBA in the States, free throws are generally scored at quite a high percentage by most players in the NBA. Your average player will make something between 70 and 80% of their free throws across a season. The highest scoring free throw players score about 90 to 92% of their free throws. And when you look at basketball, where often the margins of victory are very, very narrow, you know, you get these kind of crazy score lines like 103 against 101, those kind of score lines. If you can imagine moving from a position where, say, you're converting 70% of your free throws to a place where you're converting, say, 84% of your free throws, being able to make that kind of transition over a season makes a big difference to a team's success. And it won't surprise you that a lot of research has been done into what it is that exactly that will help you develop your competence at free throws the most. What is it that most improves the rate of conversion? Now, I think it's widely believed in any kind of area of competence and any area of skills development that if we really want to master a skill, what we need to be doing is practicing, practicing, and practicing some more. And we put our faith, we put our belief in this idea of focused, repetitive practice of one thing until we've completely nailed it. This concept of solidly practicing something until we've kind of perfected it or nailed it is at the root of what's called massed practice. Okay? And I think this idea of massed practice, of practicing and practicing and practicing until you've nailed something, is so deeply rooted in our mental construct of how competence develops that we rarely stop to consider how effective it is, or if there might be alternative, more effective approaches to developing competence. With basketball, the answer is actually very, very clear. Study after study after study has tested players and how the players most improve the percentage of conversions of free throws that they do. And guess what? If you go for the massed practice option, where basically you stand 15 feet away from the hoop and you throw and throw and throw over and over again, sure, you improve. You improve quite noticeably in the time immediately after you finish your massed practice. Although the levels of improvement actually drop back to almost where they were fairly rapidly. You can then, if you want to, push your conversion rate stats back up again by engaging in further massed practice at a later point. But again, the falling off rate back to basically where you were will then happen again, and again, and again, and again. If you were to try what might be seen as a kind of counterintuitive approach and practice free throw, why did I choose a word like free throws for a talk? It doesn't help if you're from South London where it should basically be free throws. If you're kind of thinking about improving your free throws, just give up, I'm going to call it FT or something. And you maybe try a counterintuitive approach, where instead of just practicing from 15 feet again and again, you practice from 11 feet away, then maybe you go 19 feet away, then 13, then you do a 15, then you do a 17, then maybe another 15, then maybe an 11, 13, a 17, a 19. What you find is a funny thing actually happens. If you move around the practice like this, you get better at the fixed 15 feet throws than you would under massed practice conditions, where all you're practicing is the 15 feet throws. And the improvement seems to stick much longer. The tail off is far less drastic. The dropping down is far less noticeable. And the development of the skill of the 15-foot free throw seems to be somewhat deeper than it would be if you were just practicing from 15 feet over and over again. Because, contrary, I think, to received wisdom and to common practice, it's not massed practice that really makes learning stick. It's actually spaced practice that makes learning stick. And in fact, it's not just, note to self, never do timed slides like this, because you never know which one you're on when you're not looking at the screen. Seemed like such a good idea at the time. Right, so, if you really want to see even greater improvement, I think, it's not simply spacing out the practice, trying from different kinds of positions that makes the difference. It's also interleaving or interweaving the practice with other kinds of skills. So, in other words, in basketball terms, rather than follow a sort of session of massed practice with further sessions of more massed practice, it actually means doing something like a little bit of space practice, 11 feet, 9 feet, 19 feet, 15 feet, followed by something completely different. Maybe practicing passing, or maybe practicing dribbling, or practicing blocking, or something like that. Then maybe returning and doing a bit more space practice. Then maybe doing something completely different, like actually playing a game of real basketball in which you might practice free throws as part of the game. And it's this combination of spaced practice and interleaving the spaced practice with other kinds of practice of different kinds of skills that really allows the new knowledge to bed itself into the old knowledge, and that really allows us to explore the subtleties of interaction that make up the new skill. And on top of that, it also allows us to continue developing previously acquired skills that we may have spent time working on in the past. By now, some of you may be wondering what on earth you've walked into, and wondering what on earth basketball has to do with any of you. Well, I think this idea of maximising progress by spacing out the practice and interleaving the practice with other kinds of skills isn't exclusive to ball sports. If you take driving, for example, I learned to drive quite late. I was 35 when I finally sort of knuckled down and tried to become a driver. And possibly, like many of you who drive in the room, I really struggled with parking. I live in a kind of hilly part of North London, and I found that the variables that came into play while I was trying to park, you know, the amount of space that you have available to park in, the gradation of the steepness of the hill, whether you're parking on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, made parking a real challenge for me. My instructor's solution was not to devote 2 whole lessons to massed practice of parking and then never revisit parking again until just before the test. Instead, actually, what my instructor did was to run me through the basic principles of parking. We practiced a few times under a range of different conditions, and then we returned to this in every single lesson. It was basically just woven into the general fabric of what I was doing in my driving lessons. Often at unexpected times. Sometimes it would be after I've done a 3-point turn, sometimes it would be after I've done a little bit of practice doing roundabouts. And I think, as it is with basketball and as it is with parking, so it also is for teaching and learning of foreign languages. Sorry. This idea of distributing study time of specific structures and of particular items over several sessions, leading to better internalisation of the information, rather than conducting one particular single kind of massed practice of things, also applies to language learning and language teaching. The spacing effect, as it's called, was first noted and first coined by a German psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus, which is a lovely word to say. In 1885, he carried out what are now widely regarded as the first scientific studies into memory. He basically carried out these weird, slightly superhuman, scary experiments on himself, where he tested his ability to learn lists of meaningless syllables, things like lum, nam, mac, this kind of thing, under different conditions. And he noted that if he studied a 12-syllable list 68 times, he'd remember the list perfectly the next day if he allowed himself a refresher of 7 repetitions before the test. He then started experimenting with spacing out the exposure to these items over different periods of time. And he worked out that if he distributed the study of these kind of mad syllables over 3 days, and then again had 7 repetitions before the test, he only needed to study each list 38 times, not 68 times, in order to produce the same result. Basically meaning he cut the study time almost in half with the same result, simply by spacing out the practice, by distributing the practice. And over the last sort of 100+ years, the spacing effect has held up remarkably well in other kinds of research. 80 years after Ebbinghaus, there was a guy called Geoffrey Keppel, and he carried out a further sort of seminal study into all of this, where he had students learn pairings of nonsense syllables and adjectives. So he would have things like lum equals happy. And they had to learn this list so that when they saw the nonsense syllables, they'd be able to kind of regurgitate the meaning or the adjective that was paired with that particular nonsense syllable. And all of the test subjects studied these items 8 times. For half of them, they did 8 trials or 8 repetitions on one day, a kind of massed practice approach. The others studied them twice a day, spread out over 4 days. So a more kind of distributed or spaced kind of practice. And he then tested the memory of these lists either 24 hours after the initial exposure or a week after the initial exposure. And what he found was very interesting, I think, from a sort of language teaching point of view. Because where you're doing mass practice and you're studying the same list 8 times in one day, you do fairly well recalling that particular kind of set of language that you've been studying the next day. But if you're then tested a week afterwards, there's an incredible drop-off in what you remember. The distributed practice group, on the other hand, showed very, very little forgetting, even after the week-long delay. And I think even though spacing out the practice may seem harder, it may feel counterintuitive, it may feel less productive, I think the effort that's required to retrieve items provides longer lasting learning, and it allows for a more versatile application of the learning at later stages. When learning's harder, which isn't a fashionable idea in this day and age, but when learning is harder, learning is stronger and learning lasts longer. Even though the spacing effect has been verified in second language vocabulary learning, there's not been as many studies into how we learn grammar and whether this also applies to grammar. Those that have been carried out basically reveal the same thing. Where you've got kind of experimental pre-tests, post-tests, and then delayed post-tests a week or a couple of weeks later, time and time again what's been shown is that spaced distribution instruction on the sort of development of particular items, particular grammatical structures, versus massed practice or massed exposure, it's very conclusive. The immediate post-tests show very, very little difference in terms of the way the students perform or learners perform, but the delayed post tests show, time and time again, that spaced distribution and spaced exposure to new items always helps you outperform people who've studied under kind of massed practice conditions. In addition to all of this, I think, there are far steeper rates of decline, far steeper rates of forgetting of the gains that you initially make if you've studied under a massed practice kind of system than if you've studied under a distributed practice kind of system. So, that's the theory, in a sense. That's kind of where we are. And you might think, well, okay, that all seems fairly conclusive. It seems fairly obvious that spacing practice out and spacing exposure out leads to better uptake of both grammar and vocabulary. So, does it guide our practice? Because it seems fairly crystal clear that it should be guiding our practice. Sadly, I think, in the world of English language teaching, we remain enthralled to the whole concept of massed practice. You see it in course book after course book after course book. You get the presentation of a discrete piece of grammar, usually scripted and crafted in such a way so as to not include any other particular kind of grammar structure in the initial presentation because of the fear that they might somehow obscure the view of the structure that you're currently looking at. You then get what are still, sadly, frequently laughable dialogues designed to maximise the student's exposure to every possible variation of that particular grammar structure. You know, an exaggerated version, although only slightly, would be something along the lines of, I have a headache, what should I do? You should not cut your head off. You should take aspirin. How many aspirins should I take? You should not take 20, you should take 4. Thank you. And you go into the staff room and say, hey, we've done should today. You then get exercises which mass the practice of every possible variant, negatives, questions, positives, irrespective of whether those are then going to be useful in the kind of communicative task that you're going to ask your students to perform. And then there's some kind of freer, productive practice, usually something that resembles less a normal conversation and more a cunning trap designed by course-book writers to elicit common errors of the new structure, all of which can then be corrected en masse. And once you've finished with all of that, that structure then conveniently vanishes from sight for the rest of the book, and thus for the rest of the course, only to be seen again at the next level, where you get to go through it all over again. Unless, possibly, at some point during the course, you suddenly have a moment of realisation that, in fact, your massed practice of this particular item hasn't resulted in students being able to utilise that structure across a range of different kind of contexts. And you then seek to rectify this with further massed practice. Probably yet another variation on presenting that particular structure, maybe more controlled written practice, maybe not photocopied from Murphy's this time, but photocopied from a different grammar book, maybe another communication game that you've got laminated in the staff room that forces students into more massed practice. And basically what we force students to do is to gorge on what Scott Thornbury called grammar of nuggets, but I think actually a much better thought of as sort of vast, foot-wide grammar mega burgers. Basically ignoring the fact that we know what this kind of junk food does to our insides. And I think we stress about the wrong things. We stress about whether an inductive approach to a new structure is better than a deductive approach to a new structure. We stress about how long and how detailed our explanation of the subtleties of the usage of that particular structure should be. We stress about how best to give feedback on errors that students might make. And all the time, we're stressing about the wrong thing, because it's not mass practice that results in uptake of the item efficiently, it's spaced practice. And it's not just grammar that we're basically forced to do this with. It's not just grammar that we're forced to kind of present to students in large burger-sized chunks. It's also vocabulary. What we often get in course books with vocabulary is a tidy lexical set, say, 10 adjectives for describing personality, which we present and we test, and we're then encouraged to expect immediate production of. Because this kind of PPP paradigm, where we present, practice, and then expect students to produce the language, I think has also poisoned the way that we've come to think about lexical acquisition as well. And we then rarely, if ever, meet that lexis again. That lexis is then cut out of other exercises in case it somehow distracts learners from the new lexis that we're feeding them in the Metaburger. Teachers sometimes complain that bits of vocab that they've already had before will be seen as off-topic if they're in other kinds of vocabulary exercises or texts. Even slightly different meanings or slightly different usages of items that have already been studied are sort of excised and written out of the material. Because God forbid that, say, an intermediate level student who has already learned the words lose and interest as single items in some lexical set at some point, God forbid they actually come to realise that you can combine these to say things like, I lost interest in it. This kind of thing seen as being far too sophisticated for students at that level. That's the preserve of kind of CAE, CPE kinds of classes. And I think in doing all of this, what we're doing is a great disservice to our learners. We're hampering our learners and we're limiting their potential. And of course, I think we're slowing their learning, which means, in a sense, we're robbing our students of their time. And I don't think that's what any of us got into teaching as a profession to do. I mean, obviously we all got into it to carry guns, because that's really what teaching is all about these days. But I'm guessing most of you didn't get into teaching in order to rob students of your time, despite the fact that you may find yourself inadvertently doing that. So, what's to be done? Well, I would suggest the first thing to be done, and I recognise that as a coursebook writer, this suggestion will be met with cynicism and derision from some of you in the room. One of the things that I think we can do is just stop using books that impose this invalid construct of learning on us. If we're really going to act like professionals and we're going to acknowledge the impact of research on our practice, sooner or later we have to acknowledge that course books which are based on mass practice, whatever their appeal may be, and they obviously have many, many appeals because they continue to dominate the market that we consume and that we buy into. But we have to recognise at some point they're not theoretically valid in that kind of way. And they may even be slowing the student's learning or limiting the student's linguistic potential, despite the gains in competence that we may feel exist in the kind of immediate short-term aftermath of such kind of practice. As well as being a teacher, I'm also a coursebook writer myself. And I'd just like to suggest some sort of other principles that can guide us in our materials creation and in terms of what we might look for in classroom material. Personally, I believe, and I think the research also backs this up, that grammar is going to be best learned through presenting new structures alongside old structures, presenting new structures interleaved with structures that students have already encountered before. Grammar is going to be best learned through ensuring repeated exposure to structures over an extended period of time, and by allowing interleaving of the old and new consistently over time. I think it's also going to be learned best, both grammar and lexis actually, by ensuring that the vocabulary students meet is fully grammaticalised and that it's recycled consciously and consistently, both within and across levels as far as possible. Just a quick example of what this might mean in a kind of practical sense. This is from an intermediate level, kind of B1 level coursebook that I wrote. It's looking at a very familiar structure, the present perfect simple, and rather than operating on the assumption that somehow this might be new for students at this level, and doing another presentation of something they've already had presented to them at pre-intermediate and possibly even at elementary level, and rather than trying to think of ways in which we can make the rules of the usage of the grammar more difficult for the students, all we've tried to do instead is just to think about how one particular particular common exponent of that grammar, have you ever been to X, interleaves and interacts with all kinds of other grammatical structures, some of which use the present perfect, some of which don't. Oh, I've just been told I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll race through. So, in a sense, it's grammar, but not as we know it. And I think the same is true for vocabulary. This is from the kind of online corpus that goes with the Outcome series. And it's really just looking at the way in which we lexicalize, and the way in which we grammaticalize the vocabulary that we're looking at. Students can basically search through an internal corpora of all the examples of words within a particular level and across the series. And they can see things like, it never bothered me that I couldn't cook, don't let it bother you. Lots of residents were bothered by the constant noise. And again, you see some of the little patterns, you see some of the collocates, you see the examples, and you get some sense of the way in which the language is consciously recycled and revisited. And this idea of consciously recycling and consciously revisiting language that's already been encountered or taught before is also something that app designers are starting to use a lot more. I'm sure you all have seen sort of various vocabulary apps which use algorithms to recycle and revisit language. It's basically a version of the old thing that I'm sure many, teachers of a certain vintage may be more familiar with, which is basically the kind of shoebox card revision system. And it's a good system, but I think it's only as good as what's on the card or what's on the examples. And in a sense, if what you're putting on these cards or on the apps is single words, it's obviously of limited utility to students. I do a lot of Quizlet stuff with my own students and make kind of Quizlet cards. And when I'm thinking about the Quizlet cards, I'm always trying to think about ways of allowing covert recycling of both grammar and vocabulary that I know we've already met. So the students get these kind of things where it will say they've just opened another branch of Starbucks just down the road. I can still remember when they opened the first branch of McDonald's. Do you know where the nearest branch of Lloyd's Bank is? I mustn't forget to call my dad later on. I better get going. I mustn't be late. I mustn't forget to pay my gas bill. And I think just doing this kind of thing, where there's a slow churning over of grammar and lexis that's already been presented to help the new language embed itself in the old, is really, really crucial. And brings me maybe to the most important way, I think, that we as teachers can help our students get this kind of spaced, repeated practice to language, which is really to do with what we do as teachers when we give feedback on student speaking. I often worry with student speaking in course books that there's very, very little space for students to actually express themselves in a meaningful kind of way. There's almost a fear of doing anything other than encouraging students to produce what they've just studied in a kind of correct manner. And I think it's crucial that if we're going to allow our students to get spaced exposure to language, that we make sure that the speaking that they're given isn't just controlled practice of recently studied items, that it's basically a way for them to extend themselves, stretch themselves, try to say things that they don't yet have the linguistic capabilities to do, but which we can then help them with. And what you might end up with if you're doing kind of freer speaking, which allows the students to express themselves, is a whole load of stuff that as a teacher you can listen to and you can work with and you can help the students rephrase. This is from a class I taught recently. It was an intermediate level class, and the students were doing a role play set in a hotel where they were basically role playing a tourist asking for recommendations and a local who works in the hotel giving recommendations. And at the end of the speaking, this is what we end up with initially. And then through paraphrasing and eliciting and sometimes just giving students the words, you transform this into this. And what you're doing when you're doing this kind of rephrasing and reformulation and working from the student output is this constant kind of revisiting of language that you've already taught, be it grammar and vocabulary, and thus ensuring this kind of repetitive, spaced experiencing of and opportunities to notice and opportunities to ask about language which all too often in terms of coursebook presentations, is only encountered once. So, just to conclude, I think, the act of retrieving things, it may be tough, but it's really, really important. The act of being asked to remember things that you've studied already helps learning go deeper. It aids and assists memory and learning. And if things are a little bit difficult for the students, it's a good thing, because an element of difficulty leads to better uptake and upkeep of the language. It may not result in immediate gains necessarily in the way that mass practice might do, but it's going to lead to broader, deeper, longer-term learning. And I think what it means is we need grammar taught in smaller chunks. We need grammar taught fully integrated with vocabulary and with other structures. We need to be thinking about how our correction and how our reworking of student output can lead to an opportunity for space exposure and space encounters with previously studied language. And you might be thinking, well, this all still sounds a little bit snacky. But I'd like to think it's a slightly more natural kind of snack. It's not grammar nuggets or grammar mega burgers. It's basically grammar olives. Or, for those of you that like some sort of vitamin C with your spacing out, it could be seen as, grammar orange segments, if you like. Thank you very much. I've run out of time. Please feel free to have a look at the Outcome series and the Perspective series on the National Geographic stand to see some of the ways in which we've tried to implement these kind of ideas. If you'd like a copy of the talk or the PowerPoint, please just email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. And along with my co-author Andrew Walkley, I run a website and a training company called Lexical Lab. Please have a look. I have a question. So it's definitely outcomes. I couldn't comment on what other writers are doing. Yeah? Not exclusively. Yeah? Thank you very much, and I'll be around if anyone